everyone, and welcome to the webinar on ensuring equitable access. We're going to get started in a moment. I'm just going to give a little bit of time for attendees to filter in. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the webinar on ensuring equitable access to libraries' online services. My name is Brianna O'Leary, and I'm a training specialist here at BiblioCommons. I will be throwing the webinar over to Beth Jefferson shortly. But just as a brief overview, we will be recording this webinar to catch up on it later or to share with any colleagues. And we're also going to have a Q&A session at the end. So if you think of any questions during the presentation, use the Q&A function and we will be able to answer those towards the end. I also want to just get a quick show of digital hands that everyone can hear me. Awesome, fantastic. So without further ado, we're going to throw this over to Beth Jefferson, who is the CEO and co-founder of BiblioCommons.
Thanks, Brianna. I'm delighted to be here today to share with you a presentation that was the foundation for a really important discussion in New Orleans with a number of our library's directors. There was great response. We built on that and are delighted to continue the conversation here and welcome your questions and thoughts in terms of areas of investment that you're making that we may not have touched on at the end of this. We all know that libraries invest millions of dollars every year in their built infrastructure, ensuring that that built infrastructure is welcoming to all ages, that people feel they can enter, that people feel they want to enter. So whether they're older, younger, of all races, all socioeconomic backgrounds, all genders, all physical abilities, we invest to ensure not just equal services, but equitable, that people can, with the same level of effort, achieve the same outcomes. And all of that adds up in many different ways to lots of library love, as we know. This is for one library with a downtown location. We've just chosen it because it's representative of so many libraries that we see where the built infrastructure and the experience visiting it results in lots of great feelings of being cheerful, outstanding, enjoyable, a community hub. They love it. It's gorgeous. We all know that. So you've got this 5-star experience in our buildings. But we all know also that our communities are spending more and more time online. And as they do so, the percentage of the visits to the public library that are in that built environment are shrinking. And so although they're not in absolute terms, the absolute number of visits in aggregate is growing, but the share that is to the built environment is less in many cases than half now, and the other half is online. And for many patrons, that is growingly, or for our kind of heaviest users, that can often be their dominant or only experience of the public library. Even if it's not e-content that they're accessing, it can be the catalog, which then the request holds be put to the door, so they barely enter the building to pick those up and then return them in a drop-off through a drive-through in the most extreme cases. So for those patrons where their dominant experience of the public library is that web or app digital experience, it's really just a question of what level of investment are we making for that. So when you look at that same library on the same day in the App Store, what you'll see is a very different view of the library. It's antiquated, it's not optimized, it crashes and it needs fixing, it needs a better design. So we've got this tremendous contrast between the investments that we've made and the feelings that it leaves our community with in the built and digital environments. What we know is that it's not that the impact of that underinvesting in the digital experience and the quality of the user experience in the digital is disproportionately distributed to different segments of the population in terms of those who need the library and those who may face different challenges in accessing online services. So if you're in a wheelchair, accessing the built environment may be more difficult. If you're in a wheelchair, it's not necessarily more difficult in the digital, but there are other factors that come into play. And so what we wanted to do is use the same framework that we do to think about our built environments. So can people enter and use the services easily? But also equally important is, do I want to? Are they beautiful? Are they welcoming? So let's start with can I? So when we talk about different segments of the population who bring special needs to the digital environment, we've been breaking them down into 5 groups. The one that gets the most attention typically is the 5th one here, visually impaired patrons, and we will touch on that. We've been making big investments, as many of you know, over the last couple of years. And that's really for legal compliance reasons that has been getting so much attention in the last couple of years. But there are 4 communities that are actually much larger in size who can be equally disadvantaged if we don't give the same care and attention to the digital. So the first is the smartphone dependent population. So we've typically, or 10 years ago, I guess it's 8 years ago, when we first introduced our apps in response to the iPhone having been launched 2 years before that, iPhones and mobile technology was considered a luxury, as we know. But for a growing percentage of the population today, it's not by no means a luxury, it's their lifeline. And what we're seeing from the Pew data is that a growing percentage of the population has access to the internet, but a very quickly growing percentage of that has access only through their smartphone. And so where a digital experience is not optimized for mobile, those who are in the wealthier segments of the population will often have multiple devices in their home. And so if it's not optimized for mobile, that's fine. They just switch to their tablet or desktop. But for the smartphone dependent, this is their only access point. And what we see for the smartphone dependent, they are disproportionately lower income, lower education, and minority. And so those are the people who need the library most, and where we're often inadvertently erecting barriers to access when it's not mobile optimized. So there are a lot of design principles that go into a mobile optimized experience. It's now close to half of our traffic and more than half of the web's general traffic. The first is that if you have to, we believe, deliver the full desktop experience. You can't have a stripped back or pared back set of functionality available for mobile phones. Now, that's not to say that we can't have apps as a supplementary experience for our power patrons, but we must deliver the full desktop experience in a mobile optimized fashion through the browser first. As you know, we made a decision to invest heavily in responsive for 3 years before we redesigned our apps. Our apps are now, we have new apps that will be coming out at the end of the year. We think they're beautiful, and we're delighted to show them to you in a webinar next month, I believe. But the design there is to extend the catalog functionality and the mobile browser functioning, not to replicate it. We know that only power patrons will bother to download an app. And really what we're trying to do with everyone who comes through a mobile browser is make sure that they have a great experience that makes them want to return and someday become one of our power patrons. The other thing that we're seeing increasingly is that a mobile optimized experience involves much more than simply reflowing the text. It's got to be redesigned, and we'll show some examples of that. So when we talk about fitting a screen to a mobile, you can clearly see that this is not mobile optimized, it's simply mobile fits. And where we see other opportunities, this has been reflowed, but not rethought. So what does rethinking mean? It means using the conventions of mobile. So for example, what is often called either the more ellipsis or a kebab in user experience design, that these are really important to not having every piece of functionality. We want all functionality accessible, but sometimes with an additional click, because we want easily skimmable experiences, and we'll talk more about that. It's essential on mobile. We all know we use our finger and we flick through things very quickly, and we certainly don't want to pinch, pan, and zoom. When we require pinch, panning, and zooming, as we talked about earlier, this really disadvantages those that can only access through mobile. It makes every action on the step or on the site, every interaction, 2 or 3 times the amount of work, because everything requires this pinch, pan, or slide to get it in view. So smartphone dependent are a critical portion of the population, and about 30%, as we saw, of our online patrons. The second one is the low tech confidence or low digital skill patrons. They're disproportionately, though not entirely, seniors, but increasingly very much concentrated in the older age brackets. What we know from Pew data is that age is really the new digital divide. Among those, even among those in the lowest population, 18 to 29-year-olds, 96% are online and with their own device. It's really in the older age brackets that we see the great divides still persisting. What we also know among those older age groups is that they're increasingly going not to a desktop as their first point of entry onto the web, but straight from TV, as we say, to tablet, or some other mobile device that gives them communication capabilities in addition to their online access point. What we know from the feedback and from the user research that we do is that the library is a very important part of this initial early experiences for many older patrons. And when we get it right, we empower them to go further on the web. We love this piece of feedback from a Fraser Valley user, I believe, where he says, I'm 80 years old and I'm not really computer literate, but I'm driving around on your website like I know what I'm doing. So this classic imposter syndrome where he feels like he shouldn't know what he's doing, but he does. Well, clearly he's going to go have more confidence and go forth in other areas and try things. But if we get it wrong, and we do sometimes, and we're constantly trying to learn from those, we disillusion. And this one is very disheartening to read, but it's also what keeps us focused on incremental changes continuously. You can see, he says, maybe it's just my age, but I guess technology has passed me by. I get so frustrated with the process involved. My wife gets tired of me yelling at my iPad. And where we see most of this is around digital content integration. We know that's been a continual struggle for libraries and one we're continuing to invest in. But the language is consistent, where people simply say, I give up. And that, of course, is something that we can't maintain. So what for these people is when they talk about I give up or being empowered or disempowered, it's not that there are features missing. It's about the usability of those features. And I think that's really what we all need to focus on, because it's very tempting to constantly be building new features and be evaluating products on the basis of features. But ultimately, it's the usability of those features that will have the highest impact. And really, what we know is that the best digital literacy class we can offer older patrons is an integrated, usable interface that is consistent across services and devices. So what does that mean as we think about some of the design principles for designing for this community? I think one of the key things that comes up in all of the research, both ours and in the academic research, is that there's just this tremendous anxiety about pressing things and breaking things. And so a lot of the interface design principles for this community are around error recovery. So, making sure that they know that there's a way back from things. Also contextual help. The page views to our contextual help throughout the catalog experiences are very high across all of our libraries and a critical part of the experience. But simple things, also we think about the way we engage and message them. So often, libraries often, for example, want to make sure people understand privacy decisions that are in front of them. But in doing so, what we know is it's also very possible to scare them off entirely. So we want to make them aware and understanding, but we also want to nudge them forward to have more confidence and to try new things. So when we get this right, again, I think this is really important to see this the impact of this as a digital literacy environment. So again, feedback from what he describes himself, an aging member who was really angry when we first launched with this particular library and redesigned. But he says now, I love this, that he's now thoroughly embarrassed over his selfishness. And he uses the new site to its max, creating lists, following member lists for future viewing. And so just thanks the library for that teaching moment and for the confidence it's given him to try new things. This is from a staff member at a library that launched in Kansas. And I think we can see here that it's not just for patrons, and it's not that this is necessarily an older staff member, but just really its potential as an on-ramp and for expanding opportunities and minds in the digital world. And so this blogger at the library talks about this progression through. First of all, I decided to make a list, and then my one list turned into many, and I was having so much fun making them that I wondered why I was keeping them all to myself. And then I discovered this feature that I could follow people, and somebody was following me. And then she says, I have a confession, you won't find me on Facebook, and tweets are still for the birds, but I've discovered the perfect place to share my love of all things bibliophilic. It's my library. So that's a pretty nice way for people to start expanding their horizons. The third one is patrons with poor motor or typing skills. There's some overlap, obviously, with older patrons, but not entirely, and the design challenges are often different. So the first is making sure that the touch targets, as they're called, are easy to touch with a thumb. And sometimes big and clumsy thumbs. So it's really critical. That idea of a touch target is a really defining principle for those who have lower motor skills. There's also a whole bunch of things around, for example, not having automatically advancing carousels. Those are very difficult for somebody to stop who has lower motor skills. The fourth group is the text overwhelmed, lower literacy patrons or high literacy. This is, of course, a community that the public library pays special attention to. It's key in its mission and values. And there is a lot that's being written about designing interfaces for low literacy populations and for novice users. But one of the key things, and I think this is always a struggle for public libraries, because they want, in their desire to provide inclusive design, they want to make sure that they offer everyone everything. But the irony in this is that sometimes when we try to provide everything for everyone, it's overwhelming for most. And that sometimes very little is heard because there's so much noise. So there is quite a bit being written around how paralyzing too much choice is for many people, and how less can be more in many ways. Less is also more when it comes to skimmability. We know that skimming is a higher order literacy skill, and that when you have very text-dense pages that don't have visual indicators, whether it's icon where the spacing doesn't allow me to quickly see what I'm looking for, in this case, formats, in many cases having to go through many pages to see all the available formats that a library might have, that's actually very hard work for a lower literacy patron. The other area that's very important for lower literacy patrons is search relevance. If we don't get the probability of what someone is guessing, looking for right and get most of the time for most patrons those results on the first pages and ideally above the fold, we can frustrate people very quickly. And their patience for searching through pages to see if it's there is low. This was an example that was actually provided by one of our libraries. Again, it's just one of those moments where we say, oh, that's really unfortunate, and then look at ways to make it better. So the story that was told around this was about a young adult who came into a library and said she had been trying and trying to find Alice in Wonderland in the library catalog, and she couldn't find it anywhere, and this woman said she actually burst into tears. Well, it turns out that in fact what she was looking for was the text Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, and it was, as you can see here on the second page, and not in the first. And this has to do with the fact that we have In this case, we know that Google would not have done that, and Google would not have done that, or Amazon, because they give greater priority. They don't do exact text matches to title, as we have done here. They will boost social metrics like the circulating activity, holds, checkouts. And so we are now in the process. We've got a framework for testing changes to the algorithm that allow us to boost that effectively. And to really come closer to the expectations that are set by Google and Amazon for the search relevance. And then the last community is the visually impaired patrons. As you know, we have invested a lot. We signed a contract 2 years ago with a firm called Simply Accessible. It's now been bought out by another firm. I can't remember, but it does Level a lot access. Sorry?
Level Access.
Level Access. Thank you, Catherine. And they do a lot of the leading work for some of the largest Fortune 500 companies. They have quite a very disciplined framework that they put you through. And I think the important thing that's for us is it's not a one-time audit where they come in and say all these things are broken. It's the biggest emphasis is on redesigning your entire product development process, from design through quality assurance to ensure that everything that you build going forward is accessible. So as you know, we have invested strategically in features retroactively, but most of our work in accessibility, as we've introduced V2, the redesign of our core application, and moved to our React tech stack, we've been investing in everything being fully accessible as those pages are ported over, and similarly on BiblioWeb as we move to our version 3 with the Page Builder product. So it's not only can people use the service easily, but does it feel welcoming in the sense of, do I actually want to enter? So as with built environments, part of what makes people want to enter things is that they're enticing visually, aesthetically. And we see the same effect in the digital experience as we do in the built environment. So this is a really interesting set of research that was shared by the Nielsen Norman Group a couple of years back, where they found consistently that users were more tolerant of issues with usability if they found that the interface was to them pleasing. So they would persist through problems much more readily than if they thought it was ugly, bottom line. And I think we all know that. If something just sort of makes you feel, oh, that's pretty, then I'll just persist, because I think increasingly, well, I'll think, oh, they designed this beautifully, the problem must be with me, not the site. So that's obviously very important and necessary, but not sufficient. A huge part of this is really just thinking about diversity in the same way, again, for digital as we do in our buildings. So Jim Neal is, I guess, now past president of ALA, but his statement is one that would, I think, be commonplace in libraries, that it's for diversity is really about embracing, respecting, and celebrating individual differences in a safe, positive, and nurturing environment where all can participate and thrive. And that emphasis on participate is really important too. So part of that is just, if you walk into a space and the only people you see are of one gender, one race, one age, it doesn't make you feel welcome. And it's the same thing when we think about walking into or going online into a digital experience. Are the voices welcoming, and are they diverse? So just as we need diverse books, we need diverse opinions about those books. And I think that's something that we see very much reflected in some of the community building and comments that happen in the online environment as well, how important that is. So this is not us. This was an academic librarian posting in 2014 about the unbearable whiteness of librarianship, where you just can see from data that he provided how out of line, and we know this all is a big discussion topic in libraries, and we know everyone is working hard towards addressing some of these discrepancies. But today and into the future, there is expected to be a persistent gap in the composition of librarians versus their populations along language, gender, race. and age, of course, that they're not necessarily representative of the population. So what does that mean? It means that we have to be careful. We know that staff picks and recommendations are dependent on heavily for many community members, but we also know it's about giving them choice. So we always promote actively staff recommendations and talk about positioning librarians as first among equals, but it is among equals where some people are distinctly looking for peer reviews. And you can see here, excuse me, in this piece of feedback, this patron felt very strongly that it was, and again, we go back to the collections development because this has been a concern that has been top of mind among acquisitions teams for some time. We don't want just sort of what we deem people should read. We want what the community wants to read. And it's really, again, reflecting that back through the voices in the recommendations as well. You can see there are several people who have expressed similar points of view. And then we see it just in the comments in ways that are really heartfelt. So what we see often is, many people writing in a view and often librarians, like when we describe things like a very intimate portrait, where it's an outsider's perspective, one was achingly beautiful. But then you'll get views like this, which I think are very important at the top. Coates' writing style isn't to my liking. I found his arguments more amorphous and less clear to me. I'm not sure what I actually understood him. And yet what I think I understood, I liked. And I think it's just really important to point out comments like this because what it really does is give a fellow reader permission to also feel the same way. Not to think that, oh my gosh, everybody else thought this was, achingly beautiful and magnificent, but it wasn't me. And so it just allows different voices. And you see that particularly with children and some of the discrepancy between staff and their often nostalgic memories of children's books, where the children's view can often be very different. So, this is not unsurprising, but I guess I'm not the right audience for the book. It's probably a good book to give to reluctant readers, but I'm not a sports guy. And then, something that's much more blunt, which is, this book was okay, but I think it was boring. On the flip side of this, and I don't have examples, but you can go to any Diary of a Wimpy Kid page or any other page in the catalog and also see, dozens and dozens of comments, very enthusiastic with dozens of exclamation marks following them, that are very important to peer readers as young kids, where they see the enthusiasm of other readers as well. And then you can see it along race lines as well, and that where you'll have comments around a movie like Precious, where on the one hand you've got things like stunning performances and great film, wow, a very powerful movie, but it really feels like an outsider's perspective when you contrast it with something like this, which says, oh, sorry, this may not be the one, sorry, that I was looking for. I think I feel like it really throws poor Black people in real life that's been in poverty all their lives under the bus. It makes poor Black people in real life look worse than they already are. So it's not that one perspective or another is the right one, just that we ensure that all of those voices and all of those perspectives are present in the collection. I'm going to skip through this. So it's not just that those voices are present for others to read, it's that all feel that their own voice is welcome, because sharing your voice is also very affirming and very empowering. So people talk in their feedback about thanking the library for letting me share. So it's this idea that they've somehow been kept out and now we're invited in. And this is a delightful comment just from a child who tells us that he or she thinks we should let people have some conversations about the book so they can discuss their feelings, and it goes on great length. It's a potential UX designer, I think, so that she tells us that we should put the conversations in the button at the bottom of the book. And then you can see it in comments like this. I would say this website is the best. It lets me share my ideas. And just how affirming it is to see I'm not good at everything, but there are some things I'm good at. And when you invite me to participate in the things I'm good at, I love it. So finally, my pop culture counts for something. Or again, from a child, I like the quiz is fun. It shows that some people are better at some things than others. Okay, realistic here, but could you put one about hippos? I know a lot about them. And you know, it goes on, but this feeling of I made a recommendation, it was heard, and you can see from the bottom of it, I wrote a review, and then the next day I looked, it didn't have any active holds at first, and then it did, and she says, what power? So this comment by Clay Shirky is really a guiding force for us. I think sometimes we forget, we go and think that we need to chase and create a lot of shiny baubles to introduce people to new technologies. And that's true, but I think we also need to remind ourselves continually about staying the course on some of the fundamentals. So his quote here is that technology doesn't get socially interesting until it gets technologically boring, meaning that everyone is participating, everyone is feeling heard, and then we can really start to think about how we're all interacting and building community and having the kinds of conversations that we all know are so critical for libraries and for our communities to have in ways that we're not having right now. So the big challenge is just keeping up with the rest of the web as it plows through some of this and keeping those micro interactions accessible to all, so that we really can deliver the 5-star experience through our digital channels that we do through the built environment. And we often talk about bringing the best of what libraries do in their branches and combining it with the best of the rest of the web to create ultimately digital experiences that are worthy of the public libraries. So they're all built on the values, the mission, the goals of public libraries. And that's it. So we'd love to throw it open to not just questions, but any observations or comments that you might have. We know this isn't the best environment for that, but we'd love to encourage you to share them with Brietta.
Yeah, so as Beth mentioned, you'll see a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You can use that to add a question or a comment. You can also use chat, but Q&A is a bit easier to track. So we'll just hold tight for a minute and are really curious to hear what you have to say or any questions you have about Beth's amazing presentation. Okay, we have a question that just came in from Tony Hurt. I have a very specific functionality question, but it relates to the experience of mobile-only patrons. Is it possible for mobile-only patrons to access item barcodes? The checked out items page does not currently display item barcodes by default, but barcodes can be viewed by switching to print view. Unfortunately, print view does not show up on mobile. Is there another way to access item barcode information, or is this something that you are working on making available on mobile? The main use case for patrons at our library is when they have checked out multiple copies of a title or multiple issues of periodicals.
Well, that's an interesting question, and I can't say that I know the answer. Tony, I assume we'll have your registration information and we'll ask the product team to get back to you. I mean, this is a perfect example of where you know, there are all sorts of edge cases that we need to give consideration to ensure that it's accessible to all. And we'll get back to you on that.
Okay, another question from Hope Harms. Low priority, but if you get a chance, can you share the data slide about the low tech population again? I'd love to research this further for our library.
And I just want to clarify, when you say low tech populations, you're meaning the low confidence, so seniors primarily?
I'm wondering if she means the smartphone dependent users?
Right. Well, we can certainly, I mean, the video will be made available, so that will include the slides, and we're happy for you to get in touch with any further questions that you might have on that.
Okay, thanks, Hope. Do we have any other questions come in? Again, really curious to hear what you have to say about, you know, accessibility in your library, or things you've been thinking of, or thoughts from the presentation.
Okay, well, I know this is a topic that libraries give lots and lots of thought to every day, so it's not surprising, but please do follow up with any of our team. You'll have multiple contacts, I'm sure, with any thoughts or questions that you might have after the webinar. And thanks very much for attending with us today.
Yeah, thank you again. We'll also have the recording available and sent out in a follow-up email, and have a lovely Thursday, everyone.